Ethan Sanders had never believed in small-town legends. As a journalist, his world was shaped by facts, evidence, and cold, hard truths. Myths were just that, myths. He prided himself on being a skeptic, someone who could see through the shadows and stories that others found so terrifying. But something about the town of Haverhill felt different. It had been weeks since he'd left Boston, trading the suffocating city life for the quiet, rural surroundings of Massachusetts. The long highways, lined with trees and rolling hills, seemed peaceful at first. It was exactly what he thought he needed, an escape. His career had hit a low point after a failed series on paranormal frauds, and he figured a change of scenery might do him good. Haverhill was small, almost forgotten by time, with narrow streets and old wooden houses that stood weathered but stubborn against the passing decades. He rented a cottage on the outskirts, nestled near the edge of the dense forest that seemed to cradle the town in its grasp. A perfect retreat for someone looking to bury themselves in their work. Ethan had been drawn here by whispers, rumors of strange disappearances, eerie lights, and a certain shed deep in the woods that the locals avoided at all costs. The story of the shed had piqued his curiosity. It wasn't the kind of tale he'd normally waste his time on, but there was something about the way the townspeople reacted to it, how their eyes darted away, how their voices dropped to whispers when they mentioned it. They called it the Watcher's Shed. At first, he brushed it off as small-town superstition. He'd heard countless stories like it before, always the same kind of vague, ominous warnings about something lurking just out of sight, waiting to claim its next victim. Yet, for some reason, this one gnawed at him. He couldn't explain it, not in any way that made sense, but he felt unsettled. It was as if the town itself was alive, watching him from the moment he arrived. He noticed the signs almost immediately. Haverhill wasn't just quiet, it was too quiet. The streets emptied early, well before sunset. Shops closed, blinds were drawn, and doors were bolted tight. The local diner, usually bustling in small towns like this, was nearly deserted by 5 o'clock. Ethan had asked the waitress about it once, but all she said was, "It's better to stay indoors after dark, safer that way." She didn't elaborate, and he didn't push, but there was something about the way her hand trembled slightly as she poured his coffee that stuck with him. It wasn't long before he began to notice the shed. It sat at the edge of the forest, old and worn, like it had been forgotten by everyone but the trees. There was nothing remarkable about it at first glance, just a small, wooden structure with a sagging roof and vines creeping up its sides. But as Ethan passed it each day on his walks, something about it tugged at his attention. It was as though the shed was waiting for him, almost daring him to come closer. He asked a few of the locals about it, always getting the same response: nervous looks, a quick shake of the head, and a change of subject. No one wanted to talk about the Watcher or the shed. Finally, after days of silence, old Mrs. Delaney, the town's unofficial historian, offered him a clue. She was sitting on her porch, knitting in the fading afternoon light, when Ethan approached her. She looked up at him with milky, clouded eyes, her hands never stopping their rhythmic motion. "You're the one writing about the shed, aren't you?" she asked, her voice low and gravelly. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, just curious. There's a lot of stories floating around about it." Mrs. Delaney chuckled, a dry, raspy sound that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. "Stories, sure, but not all stories are meant to be told, young man. Some things are better left alone." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean? It's just an old shed. Why does everyone act so strange about it?" She paused, her hands slowing for just a moment, her gaze shifting toward the trees. "You've seen them, haven't you, the eyes?" He froze, taken aback. "What eyes?" Mrs. Delaney looked back at him, her expression grave. "The Watcher. It sees you. It sees all of us. But it only comes for those who notice it. And once you've seen it, once you've felt its eyes on you, it's already too late. It won't stop watching." Ethan swallowed hard, trying to suppress the sudden chill creeping up his spine. He hadn't seen anything. Not really. But there had been moments, late at night, when he'd felt something off, a prickling at the back of his neck, the feeling of being watched, even when no one was around. He shook his head, pushing the thought away. It was just his imagination. It had to be. "Come on," he said, forcing a laugh. "It's just a story, right? A local legend." Mrs. Delaney didn't laugh. She didn't even smile. "You should leave, Mr. Sanders, before it gets dark. Once the Watcher sees you, there's no turning back." That night, as Ethan sat in his cottage, the weight of her words pressed down on him. He tried to work, typing up notes from the day, but his mind kept drifting back to the shed, and to those eyes. He stepped outside, the cool night air wrapping around him like a shroud. The forest loomed just beyond the edge of the property, its trees standing tall and silent. Ethan scanned the tree line, half expecting to see something, anything, moving between the branches. But there was nothing, just darkness. He turned to go back inside, but then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. Two glowing points of light, deep within the woods. They hovered there, motionless, watching. His breath caught in his throat as a wave of cold terror washed over him. He blinked, and they were gone. But the feeling remained. The unmistakable sensation that, no matter where he went, no matter how hard he tried to shake it, those eyes were still there, watching, waiting. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that had settled over him since that night. The glowing eyes, deep in the woods, had been there. He knew it, but every time he tried to rationalize it, the explanation slipped away like smoke. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or perhaps a reflection from something hidden in the trees. But no matter how he tried to explain it, one fact remained. He had felt it watching, not just seen it, but felt it. The next morning, the world felt slightly off-kilter. Haverhill was as quiet as always, but there was an underlying tension, like the town was holding its breath. He wandered through the streets, noticing how the few residents he passed avoided his gaze, keeping their heads down as if they didn't want to acknowledge him. There was something else he hadn't noticed before. Every window he passed was tightly shuttered, even in the bright daylight. It was as though no one wanted to see what might be looking back. Ethan decided to dig deeper. If there was a story here, he would find it. It was, after all, why he'd come to Haverhill. He needed to understand why the town was so afraid, and more importantly, why he had felt that creeping sense of dread. His first stop was the local library, a small, aging building that stood on the corner of the main street, looking more like a forgotten relic than a place of knowledge. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the heavy scent of old paper filled his nostrils. He approached the librarian, a woman in her 50s with graying hair tied back in a tight bun. Her name tag read Margaret. "Excuse me," Ethan said, offering her a polite smile. "I'm looking for any historical records on the town, something about local legends or disappearances." Margaret gave him a tight-lipped smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "You're not the first to come asking about those things," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Oh, so it's not just a story then?" Her fingers fidgeted with the edge of her cardigan as she looked around, making sure no one else was nearby. "Some things are best left buried, Mr. Sanders. If you're wise, you'll forget about whatever you've heard and go on with your life. Trust me, there's nothing good that comes from digging into the past around here." Ethan leaned in, lowering his voice. "Look, I'm just doing my job. I've heard about the Watcher, about the shed. I saw something in the woods, and I need to know what's going on." At the mention of the Watcher, her eyes darkened. She stepped back, her expression hardening. "I won't talk about that." She turned away, ending the conversation before it could go any further. Frustrated but undeterred, Ethan decided to search through the archives himself. The town's history, like so many other small towns, was full of records detailing births, deaths, marriages, and the occasional scandal. But as he sifted through the documents, a pattern began to emerge, one he hadn't expected. Every few years, there was a spike in disappearances. They were spaced out enough to avoid attention, but frequent enough to seem more than just coincidence. And the locations of the last sightings. They all pointed toward the woods, near the shed. Each file was sparse, containing only the most basic information, names, dates, and a few terse police reports. No bodies were ever found. The victims had simply vanished without a trace, as if they had been swallowed by the earth itself. One report stood out, though, from about 30 years ago. A man named Raymond Hale, a local hunter. His last known location was near the shed, and his wife had reported him missing the day after he went out to check on something strange he had seen in the woods. There was a handwritten note at the bottom of the file, almost illegible due to the faded ink. Eyes in the dark. They follow. A chill ran down Ethan's spine. He pushed the file aside and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. So this wasn't just some old ghost story. People had been disappearing for decades. The town knew something was out there, and instead of confronting it, they'd chosen to pretend it didn't exist. He rubbed his temples, trying to shake off the growing unease. But the more he learned, the more he felt like he was being drawn deeper into something he couldn't escape. That night, Ethan returned to his cottage, his thoughts spinning. As the sun dipped below the horizon, he stared out of his window toward the forest. The trees seemed darker than usual, more imposing. And there, in the distance, he saw them again, two faint glowing eyes, hovering just at the edge of the trees. They didn't move, but he could feel them watching, unblinking, patient. He swallowed hard, feeling the cold sweat form on the back of his neck. The next morning, Ethan knew he had to confront someone who might know more. He made his way to the only person in town who had been even remotely forthcoming, Mrs. Delaney. Her house was perched on a hill at the far end of town, a weathered old building with peeling paint and a sagging porch. She sat outside, as usual, knitting in the pale morning light. "Back again?" she asked without looking up from her needles. "I need to know more about the Watcher," Ethan said, standing at the edge of the porch. "You warned me before, but I saw something last night. I'm not imagining it. What is it?" Mrs. Delaney let out a heavy sigh, finally setting her knitting aside. She looked up at Ethan, her cloudy eyes filled with something like pity. "You're a fool, boy. Once it's set its eyes on you, there's no turning back. The Watcher waits in the dark, but it doesn't just watch, it chooses. And when it does, well, you'll find out soon enough." Ethan sat down on the porch steps, frustration and curiosity battling within him. "But what is it? Why does it watch? What does it want?" Mrs. Delaney's gaze shifted toward the woods. "No one knows for sure. Some say it's been here longer than the town itself. Others think it's a curse, something tied to the land. But everyone agrees on one thing. It doesn't leave you alone once you've seen it." Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine. He wasn't superstitious, but the conviction in her voice, the weight of the town's silence, made him uneasy. He decided then that he had to go back to the shed. If the answer to this mystery lay anywhere, it would be there. The following afternoon, he found himself standing at the edge of the forest again, staring at the narrow trail that led to the shed. The sun was still high in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground, but even in the daylight, the woods felt oppressive. Each step he took into the trees was accompanied by a growing sense of dread, as if the forest itself was alive, watching him. The shed appeared ahead, its roof sagging under the weight of time and neglect. It looked so ordinary, yet Ethan felt an overwhelming sense of wrongness about the place. He stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. The air felt colder here, the light dimmer, as if the shed existed in a different world entirely. He reached for the door, but before he could touch it, a noise behind him made him freeze. A low rustling in the trees, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. He spun around, his breath catching in his throat, but there was nothing there. The forest was still, silent. Ethan stood motionless for what felt like an eternity, his eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement, but he saw nothing, no eyes, no figures, just the dense wall of trees surrounding him. He turned back to the shed, determined to push through the fear. He had come this far. He wasn't going to leave without answers. Inside, the shed was cramped and musty. Dust floated in the air, illuminated by thin beams of sunlight that filtered through the cracks in the wooden walls. The floor was covered in debris, old tools, rotting pieces of wood, and a tattered blanket crumpled in the corner. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. He moved to the back of the shed, where something caught his eye, a series of strange, carved symbols etched into the wood. They were crude but deliberate, like someone had scratched them into the wall with a knife. Ethan knelt down to examine them closer, his fingers tracing the rough lines. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps returned, louder this time, as if whoever or whatever was out there was getting closer. Ethan's pulse quickened, and he rushed outside, scanning the forest in every direction. Again, nothing. But then, just at the edge of his vision, he saw it. The eyes, closer now, brighter. And this time, they were moving toward him. Without thinking, Ethan turned and ran. The trees seemed to close in around him as he sprinted down the path, branches snagging at his clothes, the pounding of his heart deafening in his ears. He didn't stop until he burst out of the forest and onto the open field beyond, gasping for breath. He looked back, half expecting to see the eyes staring at him from the tree line, but the woods were still, silent. He was alone, but the feeling remained, that cold, creeping sensation that something was following him, watching him. Back at his cottage, Ethan tried to calm his racing thoughts. He poured himself a drink, the burn of the alcohol doing little to ease the tension in his chest. He couldn't explain what he had seen, but he knew one thing for certain. The Watcher was real, and it was getting closer. Over the next few days, Ethan threw himself into his research, desperate to find some kind of explanation. He scoured old records, interviewed more of the town's residents, but no one had any clear answers. The few who spoke of the Watcher did so in hushed tones, warning him to stop before it was too late. But Ethan couldn't stop. The eyes haunted his every waking moment. He saw them in the corners of his vision, felt their gaze on him, even when he was alone. The more he searched for answers, the more elusive they became, like the truth was slipping further out of reach with every passing day. Then, one night, as Ethan sat at his desk, poring over his notes, the lights flickered. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and for a brief moment, the air seemed to thicken, like the atmosphere had changed. His breath came in shallow gasps as he looked toward the window. The eyes were there, watching, closer than ever before. The night was still, too still. Ethan sat at his desk, staring out the window, his heart pounding in his chest. The eyes were there, as they always were now, hovering just beyond the tree line. But tonight, they felt closer. They had been getting closer every night, edging slowly forward as if testing the boundaries, as if waiting for something. He didn't know how much longer he could take this. The days were a blur of futile research and dead ends. The nights were unbearable. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw them, those glowing, unblinking eyes staring at him through the darkness. And it wasn't just his mind playing tricks on him anymore. No, he was sure of it now. The Watcher was real, and it wasn't content to stay in the shadows much longer. He needed to do something. Anything. He had to confront whatever it was out there. There was no other way. It had chosen him, and it wasn't going to stop. The Watcher didn't just observe, it wanted something, wanted him. Ethan packed his bag methodically, his hands trembling slightly as he shoved his flashlight, notebook, and a small knife into the worn canvas. He wasn't sure what good the knife would do, but it felt reassuring to have it. A last shred of control in a situation spiraling far beyond anything he could rationalize. Before heading out, he stopped by the mirror in his bathroom. His reflection stared back at him, haggard, eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights. He barely recognized himself. The toll of the past few weeks had carved deep lines into his face, his skin pale and drawn. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "You've come this far," he muttered to his reflection. "No turning back now." The air outside was colder than usual, a sharp bite that gnawed at his skin as he stepped out into the night. The sky above was a blanket of black, no stars visible, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. The forest loomed ahead, darker than ever, as if the trees themselves were conspiring to keep their secrets hidden. He hesitated for a moment, his breath visible in the cold night air. But then he pressed on. The shed stood silent, a crooked silhouette in the distance. He hadn't been back since that last terrifying encounter, and now, as he approached it again, the sense of wrongness was overwhelming. The world around him seemed to shift, the atmosphere growing heavy, almost suffocating. He reached the door, hesitating just for a second before pushing it open. Inside, the familiar scent of rot and decay hit him, but something was different. The carvings on the walls, the crude symbols he had seen before, seemed to pulse faintly with an eerie, unnatural light. The air inside was thick, oppressive, making it hard to breathe. As Ethan stepped further into the shed, a soft sound caught his attention. A low, rhythmic humming, barely audible but persistent. It was coming from beneath the floor. Kneeling down, he brushed aside the dirt and debris. revealing an old trapdoor. His heart raced. This hadn't been here before. He hesitated, the knife in his hand suddenly feeling useless against whatever was lurking below. But he couldn't stop now. He pried open the trapdoor, and a gust of cold air rushed up, carrying with it the stench of damp earth and something far older, something ancient. The steps beneath led down into a dark, narrow passage. Ethan's flashlight flickered as he descended, the beam struggling to cut through the oppressive darkness. The walls were lined with more of those strange symbols, each one glowing faintly as he passed. The further he went, the louder the humming became, and now it was accompanied by something else, a whispering, just on the edge of his perception, like voices speaking in a language he couldn't understand. At the end of the tunnel, the passage opened into a cavernous chamber. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The room was vast, far larger than he could have imagined, and in the center of it, bathed in the pale light of the glowing symbols, was something he could barely comprehend. It wasn't just the eyes anymore. The Watcher was there, but it wasn't a person or an animal. It was wrong. Its form was amorphous, shifting and flickering between shapes, sometimes humanoid, sometimes a mass of shadows and tendrils. The eyes, those glowing, unblinking eyes, were the only constant. They locked onto Ethan the moment he stepped into the room. He froze, paralyzed by a fear so deep it felt primal, like every instinct in his body was screaming at him to run. But he couldn't. He couldn't move. The Watcher didn't speak, but its presence filled the room, a tangible force pressing down on him, suffocating him. He could feel it probing his mind, pushing against the edges of his consciousness, trying to break through. Ethan's thoughts spiraled. This wasn't just a creature. It was something far older, far more powerful than anything he had ever imagined. The Watcher wasn't of this world. It was something else, something that existed beyond the veil of reality. And now, it had him. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling his mind until he thought he might go mad. He could feel the thing inside his head, pulling at his memories, his thoughts, twisting them, bending them. The room seemed to tilt, the walls warping and bending as the Watcher's influence spread. Suddenly, the ground beneath him shifted. Ethan stumbled, his flashlight falling from his hand and rolling across the floor, the beam flickering before going out completely. He was plunged into darkness, but the eyes still glowed, brighter now as if they were feeding off his fear. He had to do something. He couldn't just stand there and let it consume him. Summoning every ounce of strength, Ethan forced himself to move, to fight against the crushing weight of the Watcher's presence. He reached for his bag, fumbling for the knife, his fingers trembling. But as he pulled the blade free, a voice, low and guttural, echoed in his mind. "You cannot fight it. You are already mine." Ethan staggered back, clutching his head, the voice reverberating through his skull. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if he was still standing in the chamber or if the world around him had shifted into something else entirely. The walls seemed to pulse, the air thick with an unnatural energy. "This is not real," he told himself, over and over again. "This can't be real." But the Watcher's eyes burned into him, piercing through his thoughts, his will, stripping him of every defense he had left. He could feel himself slipping, his grip on reality fading as the entity tightened its hold on him. In a final, desperate act, Ethan raised the knife, intending to slash at the thing, to sever whatever connection it had made with him. But before he could strike, a cold, invisible force gripped his wrist, holding him in place. The Watcher's eyes flashed, and Ethan screamed as a surge of pain shot through his body, the force twisting his arm until the knife clattered to the ground. He fell to his knees, gasping for breath, his vision swimming as the Watcher loomed over him. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices all speaking at once, their words incomprehensible but filled with malice. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the pressure lifted, the Watcher's presence receded, the whispers fading into the background. Ethan blinked, disoriented, as the cavern around him shifted again, the symbols on the walls dimming. For a moment, he thought it was over, that maybe, somehow, he had survived. But as he struggled to his feet, the Watcher's voice echoed in his mind one final time, soft and insidious. "It is not over. You are marked." Ethan stumbled out of the chamber, his legs weak, his body trembling. He didn't look back. He couldn't. All he knew was that he had to get away, as far away as possible from that thing, from the eyes. But even as he emerged from the shed, the cold night air hitting his face, he knew it was too late. The Watcher had let him go, but not because he had won. It had let him go because it didn't need to keep him any longer. He was marked, and it would follow him. No matter where he went, no matter how far he ran, it would always be watching. Ethan stood in the field, staring at the dark forest, the weight of the realization settling over him like a lead blanket. The Watcher wasn't done with him. It never would be. And deep in the woods, those eyes, those terrible, unblinking eyes, were still there, watching, waiting.